I wanted to get a little bit more of a, hear a little bit of your background story. You can give me
Sure.
a couple of little bullet points and maybe we can build off there.
Sure. So maybe I'll give you a sense of what it is I do, and then I'll go back into what it is that led me to do what I'm doing.
Okay.
So right now I primarily work with men through a 6-week immersive masterclass called the Impeccable Man Masterclass. So this masterclass is a combination of daily video lessons as well as action steps. And then we have live personalized group coaching calls every single week. So any of the participants in the masterclass get access to the coaching calls for as long as they exist. So what this does is it creates the feeling and the journey of any type of men's group, where you have to meet regularly and you get to know each other and you get to check in. And it also creates a shared vocabulary and a shared toolkit that holds us all accountable to this never-ending journey of evolution that we're engaged in. Because, the work doesn't stop after 6 weeks. And so that's why it's been formulated like this. So that's the primary offering that I work with. But I also work with my partner. We do more ceremonial offerings like sacred sound journeys. And we have worked with quite a few people in regards to trauma release and subconscious reprogramming. And that's not gender specific. That's just people who are struggling with something really deep that they want to move through because it's been debilitating them for many, many years. So I do that with my partner as well. And what brought me to this is a pretty long story, but it's always a matter of how far back do I go. But I think the shortest answer I could give you is I was a really sensitive child. And because of that, I was really easy to pick on. So I got bullied a lot through grade school. And at a certain point, I just completely shut down emotionally. And I started really paying a lot of attention to studying the behaviors of other kids so I could figure out how to fit in, because what I was doing obviously wasn't working. So I wasn't safe to be who I really was. So I started trying on different social masks to see oh, will this bring me acceptance? Will this bring me love? Will this bring me value? And so I was able to fit into all of these different cliques, but I never really had one for myself because I was scared to actually get too close to people. Fast forward outside of school, and when I was 20, I had a really profound spiritual experience when I was in Guatemala that completely flipped my perception of reality upside down. At that time, I was in financial services with a really amazing company that was all about manifest your reality and thinking positive. And it was really about leadership building. So it was a really amazing company. But when I had this experience, I started to view reality in a completely different way where maybe I'll just give you a sense of the experience. At a certain point, I was on top of this Mayan temple, on top of this mountain in Guatemala. And this is going to sound pretty strange to people who have never had any type of deep meditative experience before. But I was standing on top of this temple and I was looking around me at the camp of people who were all at this temple with me. We were clearing the land and holding ceremony up there. And I could feel everything that I could see in the same way that I can feel my body. It was that tangible. And it just completely shattered my reality because it wasn't an intellectual thing. It was a tangible, visceral sensation of everything that I could see, which collapsed my idea of who I was as an individual and what reality was and what interconnectivity means and what enlightenment could be. These wisdom teachings that are spouting this doctrine of oneness, what that could actually mean. And so when I came back to Canada, I had lost interest in everything that I was engaged in, financial services. I left my partnership. I sold everything that I owned, and I started pursuing a spiritual path. And by the time I was 21, I moved to California to go to an ashram to become a monk. I wanted to take monastic vows. And so from that point forward, my life was just completely dedicated to excavating the truth, the deeper truths of reality, of who I was, of what reality is about, what enlightenment is. And obviously I didn't become a monk. I'm not in robes right now. But the monks who were responsible for intake, you know, for accepting people who wanted to become monks, they told me to go back to Canada for another year. They saw that I was in like the honeymoon phase of the spiritual path. I was having all these, meditation was so easy and I didn't care about anything except God, and all was light and joyful and wonderful. And anyway, they told me to go back to Canada. So I went back to Canada and I ended up getting into a relationship. And I was in a relationship with a very traumatized woman who had actually witnessed her partner, when she was 16 years old, shoot himself in the head. And everybody else in the house just abandoned her. And she was there alone with her dying partner. And it locked her in this state of trauma. And so anyway, I was in a relationship with this woman. And that was really when my work began, like the work that I'm doing right now. That's where my more formal training began, because it was about integrating these more esoteric spiritual principles into practical daily life, but also in regards to relationships. And it brought into stark relief what it is that actually prevents people from living in their fullest expression. And this rolls back into how I was when I was a child, where I was experiencing these traumatic moments that built on themselves to a point where there was a collapse. And as soon as that collapse happened, I started seeking out different adaptations of my behavior to see how I could fit in, how I could win in, you know, the societal game that we're playing. And then the experience with that partner that I was in, trying to like integrate these spiritual practices, having just come back from an ashram where it's very simple living, you know, you like meditate 3-4 hours a day, you like give yourself to selfless service, and then I don't know, maybe you'll like chant in the evenings, play some volleyball with the guys who are there or whatever. It's very, very beautiful, simple living. And then coming back and having to deal with money, having to figure out jobs, having to deal with other people, having to navigate a spiritual practice in the midst of the chaos of our society, and being in a relationship with a woman who was struggling with a lot of emotional dysregulation. All of that coming together caused a lot of challenge for me. And it just, I think out of necessity more than anything else, I started studying and practicing different ways of communicating, eventually working with developmental disabilities and high-risk foster youth. I continued traveling and training when it was available to me. I've spent over 2 years, almost 3 years at different spiritual communities or ashrams or immersive trainings. And eventually I ended up getting certified in a process called transformative art, which is about building living relationships with the energies that you are in connection to. And the teacher of this program, her name is Dana Lynn Anderson. She has a background in the same spiritual path that I do, which is Kriya Yoga. So she was using the same vocabulary. She has a PhD in consciousness studies from Johns Hopkins University. So she's very, very articulate in the realm of spirituality, but she applies it to artistic and creative expression. And to me, that was the bridge. That was the bridge between this vast inner world that I had developed, partly out of a defense mechanism and partly out of spiritual desire, to actually come forward in life as an authentic being, as somebody who is connected to emotions and to other people, to be able to communicate, to be able to express myself authentically. It all came down to this particular program that acted as that bridge. That was about cultivating a living relationship with thoughts and with emotions and removing identity from them. So if this is like my emotion of anger, and I start looking at it and I start noticing its qualities, not from an intellectual level alone, but incorporating the feeling sense of it, where it shows up in the body, how it feels emotionally, and then exploring it. Like, what does anger move like? What does anger sound like? What does anger want to, you know, if anger was a poem, what would that poem be? You know, and actually exploring and expressing these qualities in a liberated sense, because now there was like a safe container to explore it rather than being like immersed in the identity of it. That catalyzed the desire to start facilitating, to start teaching, because that was the solution to so many of the problems that I was facing as somebody who didn't really successfully integrate back into society for many years. I kept wanting to get away, but that was the bridge for me. And as soon as I found it, I started writing and sharing spoken word poetry, and that started actually drawing people towards me, and I started facilitating, and then I started coaching and leading workshops, and that led to the creation of this masterclass, which is basically the consolidation of the last 12 years of my life of immersive study and practice in a variety of ancient wisdom teachings, to consciousness studies, to transformative art, to the work that I've done with developmental disabilities and high-risk foster youth. And all of it comes down into this program, which is really about learning how to regulate and how to engage in life from a place of authentic fullness consistently in a way that builds connection and fulfillment as a whole, you know, and identifying the key blockages that is preventing people from going there, which turns out is pretty universal.
Right. Well, that was fantastic. Man, I don't even know where to start start back to pick up on, because I honestly feel like, you know, as far as like your origin story, so to speak, is very similar to my own. And I feel like most people that are inclined to like coaching, spirituality, identify with this being a sensitive child and, you know, moving through a chaotic world. Now, for me, for a long time, I couldn't understand. I felt like I was attracting these situations. And as I got older, I've always had, as far as going into why I'm here now, I do have sort of a past with CPTSD. Now, it was funny because for me, it was not that anything ever severely traumatic. Like, it wasn't like my parents were alcoholics. It's not like I was physically abused. But there was sort of a enmeshed, dysfunctional, nothing inherently abusive or awful, but where I was not able to express my emotions, or I felt like I had to scale myself back so that they could function. So when I go into, I mean, this seems to be the area that I'm heading in. But ultimately what led me into discovering this was, after going through several very toxic relationships, I really had to take a step back and look at myself, because I had moved so much for so long throughout the world. Well, why does this keep happening to me? Why does this keep happening to me? And then I realized that I was sort of creating these situations and boundaries.
Right.
These boundaries, I was not the victim, right? I was allowing people to surpass my boundaries. I had soft boundaries. I had, you know what I mean? I'd say one thing and then, sure, come along and, you know, you can come into my circle. And anyway, it took a very long time for me to finally realize that. And throughout the whole process, I was always very, even as a child, I remember being sort of in tune with spirituality, that it had hit a point to where I was actually utterly rejecting it, because I didn't want to be the odd one. I didn't want to be the, you know what I mean? And then taking up all these masks, there was, for so long, I actually went through an active resistance
Mm.
stage. Until later on, I had my profound spiritual experience, which is actually quite comical, but I love it because I couldn't have it any other way. Um, I had met a friend and we went to the beach. I remember this was this person that I met. It was somebody that I dated. We're still the best of friends now. But when we met, I said, "Oh God," I was so nervous. Here we go again. This is my cycle. I had recognized that I attract these certain types of people, and I said, I was scared. I was terrified. And so we went to the beach, and at the beach, we're standing and we're looking at the ocean. And we look down the dock, and there's a squirrel. And he says, look at the squirrel. It's looking at the water. And I'm laughing. I'm laughing like, oh, and then I stop and I really look at the squirrel. I'm telling you, this squirrel, it was like if you could feel all the energy, you know what I mean? There was just this energy of like connectivity of like being larger than, okay, yes, it's so much more the things that are around us, the more, you know, because at first I'm looking at a squirrel, you know what I mean? Like they're quite ridiculous and quite, but as I'm standing there watching, I'm looking to see if it could have been looking at a nut or some kind of something, and there was nothing else for this, for there was nothing. I'm like, this can't be, you know, and it really just like drew me in, and it was like in that moment there was like a cellular, like on a cellular level, like you said, it's a feeling of the body, like almost like this, like there is a lot more going on than what I have been. You know, so it was quite funny, and then from there on, this ended up leading to a lot of more events that kind of just brought me closer and closer and closer back to home within myself, which ultimately led me to my final term at my university, where I took Zen and Buddhism as a class. And what ended up happening there, it was primarily a historical, you know, we talked about the religion, but more from a historical approach. And we were guided through a 10-page paper that my professor had ended up choosing my paper to be a presentation, which ended up being an interdisciplinary field involving evolutionary psychology, the religious history of Zen, and where it was derived from, pragmatism, you know, social interactionism, how we develop and cultivate the self. And really it all fell under this field of film aesthetics, which is being studied. It's actually created by my mentor, and they're now leading like global meetings, getting people, doctors from all around the world into studying this field of perception, how we perceive things in the body, and like really just expanding in a very beautiful way. And both practice Zen. Both of my professor and this professor both studied Zen together, and they practice it as well.
Beautiful.
So yeah, it was quite an interesting experience. And what I found was I had been studying psychology, and going into this, I was able to tie the secular knowledge with the spiritual, you know, because usually we look at the two and they're always like butting
away from me.
yeah, they're like they're, and it's so funny because in Buddhism, now you said you went to study with the monastics, what sect did you know, there's so many different flavors of what as far as that goes, like now we speak of duality and non-duality, you know, you can't have one without the other, right?
Mm-hmm. So
Yeah, I'm not.
the teachings that I practice, that I'm initiated into, are the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. He founded an organization called Self-Realization Fellowship back in the early 1900s, and he is one of the forerunners of yoga in the West. So that path is Kriya Yoga, which is also known as Raja Yoga. It's a comprehensive yogic path that includes all the other branches, but it also initiates people into a particular meditative technique called Kriya Yoga. So that's of the Giri order of that lineage, and which means mountain. And basically, it's a comprehensive path where you're incorporating karma yoga, which is selfless service, and bhakti yoga, which is devotion, and jnana yoga, which is study, and hatha yoga, which is, you know, the postures, and then kriya yoga, which is a form of pranayama. That being said, I grew up as a Catholic, and so I was part of I was part of the church. I was actually an altar boy when I was growing up, and ended up resenting religion. Actually, I ended up, you know, I wasn't exposed to anything else, so I decided I was going to be an atheist when I was 10 or 11 years old or something. There's too much hypocrisy going on, and you could tell even as a child. It's like, there's something off here. You know, you're telling me to behave in certain ways, but I don't see those things in anyone else. So if I don't do them, why am I getting banished to an eternity of hellfire and suffering? That's bullshit.
Right.
I like resented that. But I was able to establish some sort of foundation of like spiritual awareness by being brought up as a Catholic, where it's like, no, there are these invisible forces that you're connected to, and this great mystery of life. You know, it was right in the same ballpark as like Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny and fairies. It's like this magical world that we live in that nobody fully understands, you know, and we can actually like connect to these invisible forces through things like prayer and contemplation and trying to align ourselves with virtue. You know, like that foundation was set, but then through like my teenage years and young adult years, I didn't care about any of that. It didn't serve me at any point in time in my life in a practical way as like a teenager, when I was being bullied, when everybody was being an asshole to me and all the teachers were miserable and I had no sense of value or self-worth, regardless of how much praying I did. None of that mattered. But anyway, I had this spiritual experience and started developing this energetic sensitivity to fields of energy that you can start developing the skill of sensing and interacting with, which then led to this spiritual experience. That led me to yoga, because yoga, just like Buddhism, is very much a spiritual science. It has a meticulous experiential component to it that was very, very important to me, that is being reinforced and supported by a lot of science of the Western world that is emerging these days, a lot of cognitive sciences and psychosomatic sciences.
That
Which
was
is
part of my study. Yeah.
Yeah, which is absolutely beautiful. I love the merging of those things. But one of the things that drew me to the teachings that I was practicing of Paramahansa Yogananda is right in the very first lesson that you get. They mail out lessons, 2 lessons every 2 weeks for about 2 years. Is don't believe anything that I teach you if it goes against your direct experience. But I will say, take these lessons and apply them, and then let that experience prove their validity to you. And I was like, okay, great. Let's turn my life into a spiritual experiment. And so that's what I began doing, and started experiencing exactly what it was that Yogananda was talking about, which are these fairly profound, esoteric things that, you know, if you talk about in casual conversation, they sound like something that, you know, your hippie friend who takes LSD every 2 days will, you know, be talking about, you know, at a party or something. But there's such profound truths in these ancient teachings that go back thousands and thousands of years that we're just catching up to now. that we
Yes.
can get access to through these things like LSD and plant medicine and stuff like that, but it's not grounded in practical application.
Exactly.
And that is what these spiritual sciences are designed to do, to bring us into healthy relationship with the forces, the invisible forces that we're connected to that are increasingly, that are more powerful, like the smaller you go, like electricity, and then you go down into the atomic structure, and then you go down into the molecular level, and then you go down into the quantum realm. Like there's exponential power as you go down into these finer forces. And on spiritual terms, you're actually tapping into greater spiritual realms, you know, because you're getting away from this physical density and you're going into the finer, more fundamental aspects of creation.
Right.
This is what the spiritual sciences teach. So that's the spiritual background that I have. But there's one other component that I forgot to mention in my whole story is I'm also a firekeeper and a drummer with an indigenous ceremony down in southern Alberta since 2013. It's a Blackfoot Sundance. And I don't teach any of those things. I'm not an expert in that realm, but I will say that indigenous ceremony has had a huge impact in how I view reality and life, and how I've been taught to approach healthy relationship with the living world, and to maintain a sense of levity and humor about the whole thing. That can sometimes be lost in yoga and in, like, you know, Western approach to religion and Catholicism, and those things is very super serious. But
Oh yeah.
but the indigenous ceremonies, there's so many jokes that are happening all the time, even in the face of grief. It's such a beautiful way.
Yeah.
So I'd say those are like the
important there too,
pillars
especially
for
in the
me.
face of grief. Especially in the face of grief.
Yeah. Yeah, we need that.
Yeah. So touching on this kind of, it's funny because where I found the biggest crossover with this, you know, secularism and spirituality, where I found sort of the pathway into seeing that, yes, we can have, it is in fact both. You know what I mean? It is both. We don't have to have one without the other. Now, I'm not talking about, when I say this, I'm not talking about, to each their own as far as religion. I personally, I have been in them, and actually, as far as Zen and Buddhism goes, they warn of congregation, you know what I mean? And that is actually specifically why they tell you, don't just take what I am telling you as truth. Find out for yourself. As far as Zen Buddhism goes, that was very, very important. They were actually a big part of their history is this conflict between iconoclasm and ritual. Iconoclasm being the smashing of tradition and ritual for its mundanity. Okay, so you know, you picture being raised Catholic, the things that you did that you were doing just because you were told to, and they were right. And if I'm doing this, then I'm not going to hell, right? But there was not one more thought further. Some people, it creates a really big fear response, and they do genuinely, you know what I mean? But I think for others, we kind of just lived through this, where we found our way into it, and now we're just kind of, okay, well, I guess I'm just doing this thing, and you know, because I'm told to. But anyway, with Zen, they actually do. There were a lot of debates from amongst the monks and their priests on how to use language. And you know, one of the first things you think of in Zen is their poetry, their way of, you know, and this is specifically done in a way so that the reader can derive their truth from it. Also, the practice, I'm not sure if you're familiar, if you had undergone this in maybe some of your monastics, the koan. Have you ever heard of koan?
Yeah, direct experience of truth.
Yes. Yes, and this is, you know what I mean, and that I actually found very fascinating. I still have more studying to do on that, but a lot of my paper did have to do on this koan. What I found interesting, though, is in evolutionary psychology, there is a field called epigenetics. I don't know if you're familiar with what that entails.
I haven't studied epigenetics, but I am familiar with the components of it, but you can go into something specific.
Okay. So with epigenetics, basically, okay, let's see if it's been a while here, but so with epigenetics, specifically, I'm going to narrow it down because that's a huge field in and of itself, right? But I'm going to talk about some of the studies first that tie in to give you a picture of it. One of the studies was that people who had been like Holocaust survivors and suffered the trauma endured as part of that, their children actually exhibited the same anxiety and psychosomatic traits, never having gone through it. They had inherited this in their DNA, right? So trauma can be not only that, but we've also seen it biologically. I believe it was in Ireland, the potato famine. Women during this period of time, women who were pregnant and gave birth to their children, the only with as far as natural selection goes, the women that would have survived during this famine would be women whose body could keep and hold, who had a slower metabolism, correct? So this kind of their genetics carried off to the baby. The only babies that would survive were babies that had slower metabolism. So in this sense, their bodies were altered around their environment and the traumatic stressors in their environment. So sometimes when we experience, sometimes a child being coined as sensitive has a parent, comes from a parent or somebody, a bloodline, who has endured or suffered through some sort of trauma, which gives us this cellular DNA activation to respond to our surroundings. Now, what happens when the surroundings are no longer the same as the environment that, you know, like now there is no famine. So now those people are going to be struggling with a slower metabolism in a surrounding where there's no famine. So it's, you know, if they're not careful, it can be detrimental, you know what I mean? Especially if we're living in, like for me, I'm living in the United States where we have fast food and all of those things around us. The food is very easily accessible. And so in this way, I found that when we talk about cellular activation, you know, this transformative experience, a lot of times I feel like, as for me, I knew that I had not gone through anything. I did end up going through traumatic things later in life, but I also knew that looking back now, I realized that I was experiencing things, being sensitive to my environment, being hyper aware and visualistic because of these things. And there were several other aspects involved with it, but I do know that my increased sensitivity to the energies around me, mainly being, you know, my parents, you know, them, or having suffered from them living with parents who were also, you know, had gone through some traumatizing experience, not being able to hold healthy relationships and patterns of communication, being a child and growing up through that and being already sensitive, to pick up on those things, learning from the way they interact with each other, and being programmed in order to function in the same way and navigate through their emotions, never truly being able to express mine. If that makes, I guess it doesn't really make sense because I have not gone into their total, but with their, there was a lot of arguing, there was a lot of,
sure. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, of course. It's just like a soup of trauma.
Exactly. You throw a whole bunch of people, there's nothing to plug into, because when you're in that state, it's very hard to, I don't think when they can acknowledge, when you have people that can't recognize their own emotions, like you said, identify, it's everything is reactionary, coming up from the gut or from wherever, the that is coming from, not knowing where. There's nothing to plug into, at that moment.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and it's a really fascinating. It's such a vast topic, like what you're saying, because epigenetics is basically, it's our I'm simplifying here, and correct me if I'm wrong. It's basically our capacity to activate different genes. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Right. So yes, as science is showing, and as spirituality has been telling us, this is part of the indigenous teachings, that what you do affects the next 7 generations in really practical ways, that we carry forward the trauma that we've endured that is unresolved, that is unprocessed, not only in our biology, but also in our psychology, like in our behavior. And then our child starts adopting that behavior, as well as having the DNA components of that, which is somatic.
Exactly.
So there's all of these things that are coming together at the same time, because our society has been built upon war after war after war. And so like Canada and United States, North America, we're like a soup of all of these different cultures that have endured all these different traumas, and you throw them all together, and we don't have like a cohesive value system, and we don't have an established way of communicating with one another respectfully. We don't have an awareness of who we are even, or how to engage in the world from an elevated place. And you throw all that in the mix with the fact that most people's behavior is the vast majority of it is unconsciously driven. It's not conscious decisions. Their worldview, their reactions, their communication skills, their perspective, their ability to interpret information has all been imprinted upon them in a program, either by society, if we're talking about women or men, there's gender conditioning, there's societal conditioning, there's ancestral conditioning, and then there's the conditioning of your immediate environment, whatever that is, with your peers, with your school.
Exactly.
And all of that is coming together to create the complete, system, the operating system that is you. And then underneath of all of that is the authentic you. And so the question that I pose often to people is, who is the authentic version of you after all of those programs are stripped away, and after the trauma is actually resolved? What is left? And that can be a scary question for a lot of people. And this is why a lot of people actually don't move through the traumatic or the unhealthy, the disempowered ways of existing that have become so familiar to them, because the unknown is more terrifying than what they've been experiencing, as painful as it has been for decades of their life. Like the absence of knowing who they really are, I'd say, is like the core cause of suffering in our Western world. And people don't know where to find it, Right. And that's something that I'm attempting to address in like a systematic way. Because what I've realized is like if we're speaking in polarities here, and this is kind of connected to the conversation I had with Savannah about the differences between masculine and feminine, not talking about gender, not talking about man and woman, but talking about universal principles of masculine and feminine. The masculine being more structure oriented, purpose driven, grounded, focused. It's like the will, the initiator. And then the feminine is life force, it's creativity, it's emotion, it's like the ocean of movement that is basking in the pleasure of novelty forever. You know, it's like this uncontainable burst of life force. And so when they come together, which is what any type of program or organization is attempting to do, it's trying to create a safe structure, like a safe boundary for the full potential of the feminine universal force to be realized. And I'll give you an example of this. So an interesting study was done with playgrounds, where they found that if the playground did not have fences around the outside of it, the children would congregate near the center of the entire area that they had to use. But as soon as they put up fences, the children would use the entire territory to play and explore. Immediately they were free because there was a safe container from which they could go and engage.
Right.
You know, so the same thing is with any type of artistic medium, where there have to be conditions to be able to liberate the creative faculty. So like with dance class, the structure would be learning different techniques of movement, like opening up the body, going to regular practice, having like a particular environment that is specifically designed for dancing. All of those structures put in place, after they are being implemented, it frees the dancer up to actually increase the range and the depth to which they can explore the possibility of movement. That is the masculine and the feminine coming together. So understanding that the entire system, the human system in its totality, from the psychology to the biology, is built upon structured processes that then free you to engage in the world in like a spontaneous expression of life force. You can start implementing different structures. You can start dissolving different operating mechanisms through systematic process that create an automatic system that liberates movement. So some of the components of this are being able to identify and regulate emotions on a really deep level, because emotions are automatic subconscious responses. And most of the time, they're coming from the past.
Yes, absolutely.
So having tools to both recognize and navigate those emotions as they arise, if you turn that into a practice, if you have tools and techniques that you draw upon, you're like, oh, okay, I recognize this thing that's happening. This is what I need to do. And you apply that tool, you start deconstructing the patterns and the programs that have been established, and you start implementing an entirely new way of perceiving and responding to experience. As soon as that becomes rooted as automatic, that's emotional intelligence. And that's an automatic way of being in the world, which then frees you up to express the fullest potential of your relationships. So that's the goal of this program that I've crafted. And any type of program that you're engaged in that has to do with self-improvement or spirituality even, you know, there's like structure to it that people can resist, you know, but it's designed to give more freedom in the long term rather than just dissolving structure and doing whatever it is you want for however long you want, because then you just default back to what's already automatic, which hasn't been working.
Yeah, definitely. And I find that funny because whenever we reach a certain, it's funny, it's like almost picturing a bubble, and whenever we want to venture out that bubble, it's actually very scary. And it's funny, I find that most people are so afraid of failure that they'd rather go back into the bubble rather than, or if they try to venture out that bubble and they feel as if they are met with some sort of resistance, it's so much more comforting to just go back in rather than take a few steps further and see things that they were not expecting, or the things that that they were, we have this from learned experiences. We have which essentially is our neurology, our brain wiring. You know what I mean? Once we form certain patterns of moving through the world, and when we do so, our natural biological response is to continue doing it because it's easier. It's I'm actually speaking from the animal point of us, right? Because we take in, especially today with computers and technology and information coming into us that all like this, just like this, we have our own filing system that will quickly, oh, that's too scary, whoop. And it's a hard function wiring into how to move through the world. So it can be very scary. And the structure that you're talking about is so important because we do have to take our time into this rewiring the way that we have been functioning. And also you were speaking about, this structure. And I found it funny how you were talking about your experience in the monastic temple, how like being in this safe structure, then you go out into the world and it's like, oh gosh, like this is harder than I thought.
Yeah.
And it's actually the typical experience though, and really part of my studies showed me that yes, there were people who went to the temple sort of as refuge. They were called laymen, so that they could live within this confine and be safe and practice, obviously, attain peace. But ultimately, the goal was not to stay separate from society forever. The goal was to eventually, find that within yourself so that you could actually move back out into society in authenticity. It's this whole process. You go there and you deconstruct all the societal templates and conditioning that you've experienced from the parents and the teachers and everything else extenuating outward, relationship templates. What should a traditional relationship look like, and how do I function in this religious and in the church or whatever? What is it? All these roles that we are expected to take on, which a huge part of us gains our sense of self from the validation of others, many others. And it's so funny because this nothingness, the idea of this, when we go into Zen, we have what's reaching a state of nothingness, right? And that is the actualization that we have placed on these many masks, and we take them on and put them, we put them on and take them off, and throughout the day many times. But ultimately, when someone is not aware of these processes, what is actually taking place, they will often find that they don't know who they are, and we are in this state of nothingness. And it is a process of deconstructing to finding out this authenticity of who we really are. If we take all those things away and understanding that, yes, the roles and the masks, they serve a purpose, but they are not the purpose. If that makes sense.
Yeah, and this is where it starts getting really interesting, because the first workshop I ever led was about reclaiming authenticity. And I want to backtrack just a little bit, because I took, the first time I studied with Dana Lynn Anderson, I was taking a program with her called Creativity and Consciousness. And we were exploring mask work. And it was this really beautiful exploration that was quite shamanic in how it was approached, where as the mask was formed, everything was done in total silence. And then when it was hardened, the class would gather around you and they'd be drumming and rattling. The teacher would come and like pop the mask off and presented it to you like you had just birthed this being. And we spent the next few weeks with these masks. And the task was to like listen to the mask to see how it wanted to be painted, how it wanted to be designed. What kind of being was this mask? that was its own entity. And then after we had the mask, we found music for, you know, its theme song. We found images from the world or the universe it inhabited. We crafted like a full wardrobe. And then we started donning the masks and experimenting. So I would have a partner and I would like put this mask on, and the partner would ask me, "What is your name? Where do you come from? Why are you here? Do you know Deus? Do you have a message for him? Are you here to teach him something? What is that thing that you're here to teach him?" And the answer would come spontaneously, and you would be speaking as the mask. And this was an incredibly powerful journey for me, because after that, we started actually exploring the relationships between the masks. And we crafted this beautiful theatrical performance that was half structured, half spontaneous, that turned out to be the entire journey of the universe. It was like this 15-minute performance piece that told the story of all of the masks. And I was like dreaming about this mask. It was like showing up in visions throughout the day. It was like deeply embedded in my psyche. And obviously it ended up being revealed to me that I was working with the most active part of my psyche at that particular time in my life. And I was able to fully flesh it out. I actually gave a name to this aspect of my being that I was dealing with, and I call it the Wanderer. And I discovered that it actually had 3 different stages. The first was the orphan, you know, feeling like I've lost my home. And then the second aspect, which was the mask as it was being represented, was the wanderer, you know, constantly seeking, that spiritual seeker who is like trying to fill this tangible emptiness, this absence, and trying to figure out why that absence is there in the first place and how to fill it. And then the last component, the third one, is the witness. You know, it's the neutral observer that is actually emptiness itself and is complete in that state. This was all revealed to me through the exploration of this mask work. And so when I moved to Vancouver for the first time, I actually moved here to start exploring the art and craft of acting, not because I wanted to be a Hollywood actor, but because I wanted to explore the art of actually being fluid in my identity without losing authenticity. Now, this is really interesting because you look at the good actors, it's an invisible art. They become something authentic. And that is what makes you feel their story. If somebody is pretending, you can tell immediately, and you're like, "Oh, that guy's faking it. He's a bad actor." You know, they have to be in the living experience of something that isn't necessarily parallel to what they're going through in their day-to-day life, but they have to have the cognitive flexibility and the flexibility in their nervous system to be able to activate different states, to use their imagination and combine that with the ability to actually memorize lines and then deliver them in spontaneous, authentic ways. It is an incredibly complex art form to be able to do. And the reason why I wanted to explore that is because I had an awareness of and an experience of the fact that who I am is not what I think about. It's not my thoughts. It's not my emotions. And yet those things change the reality that I perceive myself to be and the reality that I perceive myself as inhabiting constantly. It wraps identity up in its grasp, you know? And so to be able to start like stripping away those tendrils of like, oh, okay, I'm not actually my anger. I'm not actually my thoughts. It sounds very vague when I'm saying it conceptually, but to stop and think for a second that your entire identity is constructed of thought, feeling, beliefs. That is a story inside your head of who you are and how the world is. That's a combination of thought, feeling constructs that creates a belief. When you really understand and experience the fact that that is not true, and you start stripping those things away, your entire identity begins to dissolve, which is fucking terrifying. That is the foundation for any sense of stability in your life. It's how you relate to other people. You know, if you don't have a foundation of identity, how can you interact with other humans? How can you function as a stable human being in society in any practical, meaningful way? This is the danger of being ungrounded in any type of spiritual practice. The danger of approaching plant medicines without integrated follow through afterwards. How do you ground this? How do you apply this practically in your day-to-day life? It's absolutely necessary. That kind of structure is what creates the safety that allows you to dissolve the identity that is in fact a very, very elaborate coping mechanism for the traumas that have been accrued throughout your life, that have created your personality. It is an incredibly courageous act to start deconstructing your patterns, because your patterns and your programs are your identity. And as those things dissolve, your sense of stability will be threatened as a new version of you is allowed to finally exist as your authentic self, which you are scared to reveal is the only thing left. You know?
Right, because you're afraid, well, what if this doesn't work? I've already found out the other thing doesn't work out. So if this doesn't work, what do I do next?
Exactly.
It's a very terrifying thought.
Yeah, if your coping mechanisms, if you don't have access to your coping mechanisms anymore, or if you're aware of the fact that they're coping mechanisms and that they are starting to affect your life in a negative way, there's no other option except to do something new. And so that structure is very, very important. You know, this is my opinion of why spiritual teachings actually emerge. You know, they're not to be dogmatically latched onto. They're to provide the safe structure necessary to actually obtain the experience of dissolution of disempowered identity, of false identity, of ego, you know, so that the liberation of your authentic self can actually be revealed, which is not physical, which is not in your thoughts, which is not in your emotions. And then that leaves the question, well, where is it? Who is it? You know, and the answer to that is the great mystery that all of the spiritual teachings are guiding us towards, that you are consciousness itself, and learning what the qualities of consciousness are is the spiritual path, so that you can learn how to use those things, how to use your consciousness through this vessel, through this vessel, through this vessel, you know?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think it's great that you're incorporating this unity every week, because part of this whole big, you know, fear of going into essentially the unknown. Now I've thrown out this, you know, what I thought was me. I'm rediscovering myself, and sometimes, you know, it's like going to the clothes shopping. You try on one shirt and you're like, you know what, this is all right, but it's not quite right yet. And it is right. It's not a one day like, oh, I've realized, I've come into knowing, just like you said, it's not just simply a 6-week process either. This is something that continues. And I mean, I think it's kind of common sense. Why though? Because at every stage of life, we go through different things. At every, you know, from our childhood years into going into puberty, into becoming a young adult, and now working in, you know, gaining a foundation in career, and we're supposed to be getting married and starting a family, to then now my family is older and they're going off to college, and I'm looking at becoming a grandparent. This is a process that will continue to unfold throughout life. It just doesn't have to be so hard. It just, rather than being like, you know, it doesn't have to just happen to us to where we're playing into our own, allowing our coping mechanisms to basically drag us by the throat here, because they really do. When
Mm-hmm.
we're not conscious of them, we are, right, acting upon these reactions, and oh God, why did I say that? Or like we do essentially come back to this place of like, why did that happen? And I feel like the universal question is why? You
Mm-hmm.
know what I mean? I feel like we always get led back to that. And not only that, but what the timeless, well, what is my purpose?
Mm.
And I feel like moving through these coping mechanisms and having doing this also in this safety and comfort of this community that is going through this process with you
Mm.
is such a fundamental part of it's learning how to reconnect with others, understanding that, what, today I might not be showing up as my best self, but maybe tomorrow, I will and you won't, and I can be there and support you through this, or, we can find a way to make this work. And like you said, it's a toolbox. We each
Mm-hmm.
bring something to the table. As
Definitely.
people, we're always absorbing, taking in. I mean, this is biology in itself too.
Mm-hmm.
This, like you said, as a child, looking out at others and feeling like, well, what, this isn't working, so now I'm going to start looking at everybody else to see why, what's working for them, so I can start incorporating this.
Yeah.
This is a natural tendency. It's called social learning. We've seen this among a couple of other species of animal, but it's very useful um, to us. It is a tool that we
Mm-hmm.
can use in the correct environments where there is a
Mm-hmm.
structure. You know what I mean? There does have to be this foundation, because I've seen so many people going through this process, and if they are not finding a proper or proper solid foundation, it is actually very it's detrimental
Mm.
to it leads them down a very deep dark path. I mean, I do see,
Yeah.
I have seen that many times.
Mm-hmm.
Um,